Somewhere in the far southeast corner of Missouri, past the last of the hills, the land goes flat and wet and quiet. This is the Boot Heel, a country of swamps and soybeans and little towns most Americans couldn't find on a map. And running along its edge is the Mississippi, slow, brown, enormous, rolling south the way it has for 10,000 years. It looks like the most peaceful place on earth, but on a freezing night in the winter of 1811, this quiet stretch of river did something that should be impossible. The ground tore open, whole islands disappeared, and for several hours the most powerful river in North America stopped, turned around, and ran backwards. This is the story of the New Madrid earthquakes, the most violent earthquakes in the recorded history of the eastern United States, and almost nobody knows they happened. Here's the part that's hard to believe. We think of earthquakes as a West Coast problem, California, fault lines, the San Andreas. But the worst shaking this country has ever felt didn't come from California. It came from a sleepy farm town in Missouri, and it was strong enough to ring church bells in Boston 1,000 miles away. So what actually happened out here? The answer rewrites everything you think you know about where earthquakes happen, how far they reach, and whether this one is really over. Let's start with the river, because the river is where it stops sounding real. It began before dawn on December 16th, 1811. A woman named Eliza Bryan lived through it in the town of New Madrid, and 5 years later she wrote it down. She described a violent shock and then a sound, an awful noise, she wrote, resembling loud but distant thunder, and then the air itself filling with a thick, sulphurous vapor that turned the night to total darkness. The ground didn't just shake, it rolled in visible waves like the surface of the sea. That was the first quake. Two more of nearly equal size followed, one in January and the largest on February 7th, 1812. And it was that February shock that did the impossible thing. The riverbed itself buckled. In some places, the ground dropped away. In others, it heaved upward, throwing temporary waterfalls and rapids straight across the channel. Boatmen out on the water that night watched the river pile up in front of them, gathering up like a mountain, one of them said, rise 15, 20 feet, and then surge upstream. The Mississippi ran backwards. Not for a second, not as a trick of the eye, for hours. Scientists today even have a name for it, a fluvial tsunami. The naturalist John Bradbury was on the river that night, clinging to his moored boat in the dark, listening to the screaming of the crew and the roar of whole banks of earth collapsing into the water. Think about what it takes to do that. To make the Mississippi reverse, the ground has to rise faster than the river can pour over it. And there's a detail I love. 150 miles away in Kentucky, the painter John James Audubon was riding home when his horse suddenly spread its legs, refused to move, and groaned. Audubon thought the animal was sick. It wasn't. The horse had felt the earth coming a moment before he did. Now here's what the river did next. As the land along one stretch sank, in places more than 20 feet, the Mississippi poured sideways into the hole and never fully left. Overnight, it drowned a standing forest and filled it into an entirely new lake. It's called Real Foot Lake, just across the line in Tennessee, and it is still there today. You can paddle a canoe over the tops of the sunken trees. A lake younger than the United States itself, born in a single night, dug by an earthquake. Now, the bells. When the shaking peaked, people woke up screaming in cities hundreds of miles away. Chimneys cracked and fell in Cincinnati, 360 miles off. Sleepers shot upright in Washington, in New York, in Charleston, and in Boston, a full 1,000 miles from New Madrid. The ground moved hard enough to set church bells ringing by themselves in the dark. 1,000 miles from a swamp in Missouri. For a long time, that didn't make sense. And the answer turns out to be one of the most important facts in American geology. Out west, the crust of the earth is young and broken, crisscrossed with faults. And all those cracks soak up the energy of a quake, so the shaking dies out fast. But the eastern United States sits on old, cold, solid rock, one enormous, unbroken slab. And a slab like that rings like a bell. When New Madrid let go, the energy didn't fade. It traveled, clean and far, across half a continent. A quake out west can wreck a city. A quake here could shake a nation. Which brings us to the strangest part of the whole story. The argument that is still going on, because here's the problem. In 1811, there was not a single seismometer anywhere on planet Earth. No instruments, no recordings, nothing. Everything we know about how big these quakes were, we had to rebuild backwards, from diaries, from cracked chimneys, from how far away the bells rang. And our scientists genuinely do not agree on the answer. In the 1970s, a seismologist named Otto Nutley at St. Louis University dug through the historical record, counted more than 200 aftershocks, and put the great quakes near the very top of the scale. Then in 1996, a researcher named Arch Johnston ran his own analysis and estimated the three main shocks at magnitude 7.8 to 8.1. Monsters. Among the strongest ever to strike the continent. But then a USGS seismologist named Susan Hough took a second look. She and her colleague Morgan Page noticed that a lot of those terrifying eyewitness accounts came from towns built on soft river mud, and soft ground shakes harder, which makes a quake look bigger than it really was. Correct for that, she argued, and the numbers drop, down toward magnitude 6.8, 6.9, 7.2. Still enormous, but as little as 1/20th the energy of the higher estimate. So which was it? A magnitude 8 or a magnitude 7? Honestly, we still don't know for sure. 200 years later, the New Madrid earthquakes are real enough to have terrified a young country, and mysterious enough that our best scientists are still arguing about how big the monster actually was. And now the part you really need to hear, because here's the thing about that fault. It never went to sleep. The New Madrid seismic zone is active right now, tonight. It produces more than 200 small tremors every year, most of them too faint to feel. The last one big enough to do real damage was in 1895. And the U.S. Geological Survey puts the odds of a magnitude 6 or larger in the next 50 years at somewhere between 25 and 40%, with a real, if smaller, chance of a full repeat of 1811. But it isn't a swamp anymore. Today, around 11.5 million people live across that fault zone, spread over 8 states. Memphis sits right on the edge of it, a city of more than 1 million, most of it built long before anyone designed a building to survive an earthquake. And FEMA's own estimate for a repeat of 1811 is hard to even read out loud. Tens of thousands of casualties, more than 7 million people forced from their homes, hundreds of billions of dollars gone. Possibly the single worst natural disaster in American history, waiting quietly under a part of the country that doesn't believe it has earthquakes at all. So the next time you picture the Mississippi, slow and brown and endless, rolling peacefully south through the quiet middle of the country, remember what it is capable of. Remember that it has stopped before, that it has turned around and run the other way, and that the ground beneath that calm brown water is not finished. It's only resting.